You think you project power, but people smell the performance instantly. The truth is brutal. Most men don't possess power, they rehearse it, hoping no predator notices the weakness underneath. Look closely at most men who talk about power. They quote philosophers, they repeat lines about dominance, they stand a little straighter, lower their voice, try to appear calm, calculated, controlled. It looks convincing at first, but to anyone who actually understands power, the performance is obvious, because real power does not need rehearsal. What you see everywhere today is not strength, it is theater. A generation of men studying the appearance of dominance instead of the substance of it. They memorize posture, they memorize phrases, they memorize the aesthetics of authority. But authority itself? That part never arrives. This is why so many men feel confused. They read the books, they adopt the language, they imitate the cold tone. They repeat Machiavellian ideas like sacred scripture, yet nothing changes. People still challenge them, still ignore them, still sense something missing, and they cannot understand why. The reason is simple. Power cannot be performed. It can only be possessed, and possession leaves a completely different scent. When a man performs power, he is constantly broadcasting signals. Look how calm I am. Look how controlled I am. Look how dangerous I could be. But signals are the language of insecurity. A wolf does not announce that it is a wolf. It simply moves. The forest already understands. The moment you begin displaying power, you have already revealed something critical. You need people to see it. You need people to believe it. And the moment belief becomes necessary, authority disappears. Because real power does not ask to be recognized. It creates consequences. A powerful man does not need to explain what he is capable of. People discover it naturally, often too late. But the performer operates differently. The performer depends on observation. Without an audience, his power vanishes. Remove the room, remove the conversation, remove the validation, and suddenly the dominant man becomes quiet, uncertain, almost invisible, because what he possessed was never power, it was social theater. This is why you see so many men obsessing over optics, how to sit, how to speak slowly, how to maintain eye contact, how to look intimidating. All useful tools, but tools are not weapons, and this distinction is where most men fail. They think power is something you demonstrate, but real power is something you can use, and that difference changes everything. A man who performs dominance wants people to think he is dangerous. A man who is actually dangerous doesn't care what people think. His focus is leverage, control of outcomes, the ability to shift reality in his favor when pressure arrives. Notice something about history. The most dangerous figures were rarely theatrical. They were quiet, controlled, often underestimated. Because their power did not exist in appearance, it existed in their capacity to act. This is what Machiavelli understood better than almost anyone. Power is not the costume. Power is the knife behind the robe. Most men obsess over the robe. They polish it, adjust it, display it, and hope people mistake the cloth for the blade. But predators are not fooled by costumes. They study reactions. Pressure reveals truth. All it takes is one moment of real tension, a challenge, a confrontation, a decision under risk, and the performer hesitates. That hesitation is fatal, because power is not measured in calm environments. It is measured in moments where consequences exist, when something must be taken, protected, or destroyed. And that is where the performer collapses, because he spent years rehearsing appearance, but never built the machinery behind it. This is the brutal reality most men refuse to face. You can imitate authority forever. You can speak the language of strategy. You can look composed. But if you cannot enforce outcomes when necessary, you are not powerful. You are convincing. And convincing men are extremely common. Dangerous men are extremely rare, which is why the world is full of performers and almost empty of predators. The moment you understand this, something uncomfortable happens. You start seeing it everywhere, in conversations, in leadership, in business, in so-called alphas, men carefully crafting the image of power while quietly avoiding the responsibilities that real power requires. Because real power is not aesthetic, it is costly. It requires risk tolerance, cold decisions, the willingness to lose approval, and most men are not willing to pay that price, so they choose the easier path. They perform. They act dominant. They study charisma. They master optics. But the blade behind the robe never appears, and the world knows the difference, even if it never says it out loud, because power, real power, does not need to be explained. It is simply felt, silently, immediately, and sometimes too late. Men rarely perform power because they want attention. They perform it because they fear exposure. Exposure of weakness, exposure of uncertainty, exposure of the quiet suspicion they carry inside that they are not built for the brutal mathematics of power. So instead of confronting that suspicion, they construct armor. Not real armor, psychological armor. A performance. It begins subtly. A man notices that dominance earns respect. He observes that calm voices, strong posture, and controlled emotion attract influence. He studies powerful figures, analyzes their language, their tone, their presence. At first, this seems intelligent, but something dangerous happens in this process. Instead of developing power, he begins imitating the signals of it. The signals become the objective, the appearance becomes the victory, and the internal machinery, the discipline, the strategic thinking, the emotional detachment, the ability to act decisively when outcomes are uncertain. Performers rarely build this system, because building it is brutal. It requires silence, isolation, years of operating without recognition. Most men cannot tolerate that environment. They want the rewards of power long before they earn the capacity for it, so they polish the performance instead. They become excellent at appearing composed. They master the art of slow speech, controlled facial expressions, strategic silence. But these are surface tactics. They resemble power the way a statue resembles a soldier. From a distance, the illusion works. Up close, the truth becomes obvious. The statue cannot move, it cannot act, it cannot fight. This is why predators instantly recognize performers, because predators study behavior under pressure. They watch how a man reacts when challenged, when insulted, when resources are threatened, when status is attacked. And in those moments, the performer reveals himself. He hesitates, over-explains, seeks validation, attempts to restore perception rather than control outcomes. That is the psychological fingerprint of imitation. The performer is always trying to maintain the image. The powerful man is only concerned with maintaining control. Two completely different objectives. This is the brutal irony most men never understand. The more you care about appearing powerful, the less power you actually possess, because attention is limited. Every ounce of mental energy spent managing your image is energy not spent building leverage, not spent studying systems, not spent developing the cold decision-making ability that power requires. The performer lives in the world of observers. The dangerous man lives in the world of consequences. Observers care about signals. Consequences care about results. And results are merciless. They ignore tone. They ignore posture. They ignore philosophy. Results only recognize one thing: control. Who can move resources? Who can influence outcomes? Who can act decisively when the environment becomes hostile? Everything else is decoration.
This is why the psychology of performance is so seductive. It allows a man to feel powerful without becoming powerful. It delivers the emotional experience of authority without the brutal work required to obtain it. But eventually, reality arrives. Reality does not respect performance. Reality does not negotiate with illusion. Reality tests every man eventually, and when that moment comes, the performer discovers something terrifying. All the rehearsed dominance, all the memorized philosophy, all the carefully crafted posture cannot replace one simple thing: the ability to act without hesitation when the cost of action is real. That ability cannot be performed. It can only be built, slowly, coldly, privately. And most men never build it, which is why they remain actors, convincing actors sometimes, but actors nonetheless.
Once you understand that most men perform power instead of possessing it, a pattern begins to appear. The performances are not random. They follow recognizable archetypes, masks. Each mask attempts to simulate authority in a different way, but all of them share the same flaw. They imitate the signals of power while lacking the structure behind it. And once you know these masks, you will start seeing them everywhere. Because most performers unconsciously fall into one of three categories: the loud alpha, the intellectual tyrant, and the silent pretender. Three different costumes, one identical weakness. The loud alpha. This is the most visible performer. The loud alpha believes power must be displayed aggressively. His voice is louder, his posture is exaggerated, his opinions arrive with absolute certainty. He dominates conversations, interrupts frequently, uses intimidation tactics to maintain psychological space. From a distance, this looks like strength, but loud alphas are usually compensating for something fragile. They rely on volume and intensity because they cannot rely on leverage. They mistake forcefulness for control. The loud alpha's entire strategy is simple. If I appear dominant enough, people will assume I am dangerous. And sometimes it works. Many environments reward loudness: meetings, social gatherings, online discussions. In spaces where perception dominates reality, loud alphas often rise quickly, but real power environments expose them instantly. Because loud alphas struggle with one critical weakness: they cannot tolerate resistance. The moment someone pushes back, calmly, strategically, without emotional reaction, the loud alpha becomes unstable. He escalates, raises his voice further, attempts to overpower the situation through aggression, and that escalation reveals the truth. He is not controlling the environment, he is reacting to it. Predators notice this immediately, because real power is calm under resistance, not louder. The loud alpha is simply the easiest performer to identify. The intellectual tyrant. The second archetype performs power through intellectual theater. Instead of dominating with volume, the intellectual tyrant dominates with concepts. He quotes philosophers constantly, explains strategy in abstract language, uses complex vocabulary to create the impression of deep understanding. His power performance is built on intellectual intimidation. He wants people to think, this man must be dangerous, he understands everything. The intellectual tyrant believes knowledge equals authority. And knowledge does create influence, but there is a critical difference between studying power and wielding it. The intellectual tyrant spends most of his time analyzing, debating, explaining, breaking down human nature in theoretical frameworks. But theory has a weakness. It rarely survives real confrontation, because the world does not behave like books. Situations change, pressure distorts plans, people behave irrationally, and in those moments, the intellectual tyrant often freezes. He overthinks, he analyzes options while others move.
because he trained his mind to interpret power, not execute it. His authority exists in explanation, but power is not explanation. Power is action under uncertainty. Predators recognize intellectual tyrants easily. They ask one simple question internally: can this man act, or can he only describe action? Most intellectual tyrants fail that test. The silent pretender. The third archetype is the most difficult to detect. The silent pretender performs power through mystery. He speaks very little, maintains an unreadable expression, moves slowly, carefully, trying to appear calculating. This archetype is common among men who study Stoicism or dark psychology aesthetics. They believe silence automatically creates authority, so they withdraw, observe, keep conversations minimal. And from the outside, it can appear impressive. People often project intelligence onto quiet individuals. But the silent pretender has a problem. His silence is not strategic. It is defensive. He is not silent because he controls the environment. He is silent because he is unsure how to move inside it. The difference is subtle but devastating. Strategic silence creates pressure. Defensive silence creates distance. Predators detect this difference quickly. They test the silent pretender with small confrontations, questions, challenges, unexpected situations, and if the silence is merely hesitation disguised as control, it collapses. Because silence alone is not power. Silence only becomes power when it hides decisive capability. Without that capability, silence becomes invisibility. One core weakness. These three archetypes appear different on the surface. The loud alpha uses force, the intellectual tyrant uses intellect, the silent pretender uses mystery, but they share one fatal similarity. All three are obsessed with how they appear. Their energy flows towards perception, maintaining dominance, maintaining intelligence, maintaining composure. But power is not maintained through appearance. Power is maintained through control of outcomes. The loud alpha cannot control outcomes without aggression. The intellectual tyrant cannot control outcomes without explanation. The silent pretender cannot control outcomes at all. And this is why predators eventually dismantle them. Because predators are not studying the performance, they are studying the structure beneath it. And when the structure is missing, the performance becomes irrelevant. Which leads to the next brutal reality. Truly dangerous individuals do not need time to discover performers. They detect them almost immediately, sometimes within minutes, sometimes within seconds. Because predators are not looking for confidence, they are looking for fragility under pressure, and performers always reveal it. Predators are patient. They rarely reveal themselves immediately. They observe first. Watch long enough and you will notice something unsettling about truly dangerous individuals. They do not react quickly to displays of dominance. They do not challenge loudly. They do not argue emotionally. They do not compete for attention in the room. They watch. Because predators are not impressed by signals. They are studying structure. The performer believes power exists in how others perceive him. The predator knows power exists in how a man behaves when pressure appears. So the predator waits for pressure. And when it arrives, the test begins. The first test is usually small, a slight challenge, a contradiction, a quiet refusal to accept the performer's authority. To the outside observer, it may look insignificant, but psychologically, it is a surgical probe. The predator is not attacking, he is measuring. Measuring emotional stability, measuring reaction speed, measuring whether the man in front of him is controlling the environment or merely controlling his posture. The loud alpha fails this test quickly.
because the loud alpha is addicted to dominance displays. When challenged, he escalates, raises his voice, attempts to crush the disagreement through aggression, and that reaction reveals something important. He is reacting, not controlling. And once a predator sees that reaction, the game changes, because reactive men are predictable. Predictable men are controllable. Now the predator knows how to manipulate him. Apply pressure, trigger the reaction, watch him destabilize. The intellectual tyrant fails in a different way. When confronted, he explains, he justifies, he attempts to intellectually overpower the situation. But predators are not debating ideas, they are measuring decisiveness, and explanation reveals hesitation. It shows that the man is trying to win the argument, not control the outcome. So the predator increases pressure, interrupts the explanation, changes the subject, forces a decision, and suddenly the intellectual tyrant's carefully structured logic collapses, because theory struggles in chaotic environments. The silent pretender fails in the most subtle way. At first his silence appears controlled, but when the predator introduces uncertainty, unexpected questions, social friction, sudden decisions, the silence becomes empty, not strategic, just absence, a pause where action should exist. Predators recognize this instantly, because real power does not freeze under pressure, it moves. Quietly, perhaps, but it moves. This is why performers are rarely aware that they are being tested. The predator never announces the examination. There is no warning, no obvious confrontation, just small moments where the mask is gently pushed, and in those moments, the truth leaks out. This dynamic has existed throughout history. Courts, kingdoms, military command structures.
At some point, every man who studies power faces a brutal realization. Everything he thought signaled strength was mostly theater. The voice control, the posture, the memorized philosophies, the carefully constructed aura of dominance. All useful tools, but tools are not power. And the moment a man understands this, he stands at a crossroads. He can double down on the performance, or he can abandon the stage entirely. Most men choose the first option, because abandoning the performance means confronting something uncomfortable, the absence of real leverage. Real power is rarely visible at first. It exists in systems, positions, relationships, and capabilities that most observers cannot see, which is why performers struggle to develop it. It does not provide immediate recognition, no applause, no social validation, just slow accumulation of influence. To move from performer to operator, a man must reverse his priorities. The performer asks, "How do I appear powerful?" The operator asks, "What can I control?" This question changes everything, because control forces a man to think in terms of leverage rather than perception. Leverage over resources, leverage over information, leverage over decisions, leverage over timing. These are the currencies of real power, and they rarely exist on the surface. An operator studies environments like a strategist studying a battlefield. He identifies who actually controls outcomes, who moves money, who controls information flow, who influences decisions quietly, because the loudest individual in the room is almost never the one with the most power. The real operator often appears ordinary, sometimes even invisible. But invisibility is useful. When people are focused on performers, they stop watching the machinery, and operators live inside the machinery. This requires a different mindset entirely. The performer tries to dominate rooms. The operator tries to understand systems. Who benefits from what? Where pressure points exist? What decisions shape the environment?
Once a man understands systems, he stops wasting energy on dominance displays, because dominance without leverage is fragile. It depends entirely on other people's perceptions. Leverage does not. Leverage changes outcomes whether people like you or not. This is why operators are often misunderstood. They do not seek attention. They rarely argue publicly. They avoid unnecessary confrontation, not out of weakness, but because visible conflict often benefits performers. Operators prefer something else: position. Position allows control without noise, control without explanation, control without needing to convince anyone. And once a man begins thinking this way, his behavior shifts dramatically. He speaks less, not as a tactic, but because most conversations become strategically irrelevant. He stops trying to appear impressive, because impressing observers does not increase leverage. He becomes patient, because leverage grows over time. He becomes selective, because every alliance, every commitment, every environment either strengthens or weakens his position. This patience is what performers cannot tolerate. Performers crave recognition. They want the room to see them. The operator is willing to remain unseen for years if it strengthens his position. Because when pressure arrives, and it always does, visibility means nothing. Only control matters. And control comes from preparation. Preparation in skills, preparation in resources, preparation in understanding how human beings behave when stakes rise. Operators train themselves to act under consequence. They deliberately place themselves in situations where decisions matter, where hesitation carries cost, because this is the only environment where real power develops. Pressure refines clarity. Risk sharpens judgment. Consequences eliminate illusion. This process is uncomfortable, which is why most men avoid it. They remain performers because performance feels safe. Performance protects identity. It allows a man to appear powerful without ever risking failure. But operators accept something performers cannot. Failure is part of the structure. Mistakes reveal weaknesses. Weaknesses can be corrected. Illusions cannot. Once a man abandons the need to appear powerful, something strange happens. He becomes harder to read, harder to predict, harder to manipulate. Because performers are easy to control, you simply threaten their image. Operators do not protect an image, they protect outcomes. And outcomes require flexibility, adaptation, sometimes even temporary retreat. This is where Machiavellian thinking becomes relevant. Machiavelli never advised men to appear noble. He advised them to maintain control of fortune, which sometimes requires ruthlessness, sometimes patience, sometimes deception, but always strategy. The operator understands this instinctively. He does not worship principles, he studies consequences. If a move increases leverage, he considers it. If it weakens his position, he avoids it. Cold, practical, strategic. This is the true shift from performer to operator. The performer lives inside perception. The operator lives inside reality. And reality does not reward appearances. Reality rewards the man who quietly positions himself where decisions are made, where resources move, where outcomes are determined, because that is where power actually lives. Not in the spotlight, but behind it. To become dangerous, something inside you must disappear. Not your ambition, not your intelligence, not your desire to control outcomes. What must die is far more subtle, the need to be seen as powerful. Most men never cross this threshold because their identity is built entirely around perception. They want respect, they want recognition, they want others to acknowledge their authority. So they construct behaviors that attract those reactions.
They speak in certain tones, adopt certain philosophies, project certain emotions. Everything becomes part of a carefully maintained image. But this image is a prison, because the moment a man depends on recognition, he becomes predictable. He must defend the image, protect the identity, maintain the illusion of strength, even when the environment demands something else. This is where performers break, because reality does not respect identity. Reality introduces situations where every option damages your image. You must make unpopular decisions, break alliances, act ruthlessly, withdraw when others expect dominance, strike when others expect patience. These actions destroy carefully crafted identities, which is why performers avoid them. They would rather protect their image than control the outcome. Dangerous men make the opposite calculation. They abandon the image entirely. This is the death of the performer. The moment a man stops asking, "How will this make me look?" and begins asking, "What outcome do I want?" This shift appears simple, but psychologically it is violent, because human beings are deeply attached to identity. We build stories about ourselves, strong, honorable, dominant, respected. And once these identities solidify, they become fragile. Every situation becomes a test. Every interaction becomes a threat. If someone challenges you, you must respond aggressively. If someone disrespects you, you must retaliate. If someone questions you, you must prove yourself. The performer becomes trapped in endless reaction, protecting a brand instead of controlling reality. Dangerous men refuse this trap. They operate without needing validation, which means they are free to behave strategically. Sometimes they appear calm, sometimes indifferent, sometimes ruthless, sometimes cooperative, whatever the situation requires, because they are not defending a personality, they are pursuing outcomes. This flexibility makes them extremely difficult to manipulate. You cannot provoke them easily. You cannot shame them into action. You cannot bait them with ego, because ego is no longer their operating system. This is why true power often appears quiet. Observers mistake this quietness for passivity, but it is not passivity. It is independence from approval. A dangerous man does not need to prove anything in every interaction. He does not chase respect. He allows behavior over time to establish reputation. And if someone misjudges him, that is acceptable, because perception is temporary, control is permanent. This mindset creates an enormous psychological advantage.
Most men believe power must be visible. They think dangerous individuals are obvious, dominant personalities, commanding voices, men who enter a room and immediately capture attention. But this belief is convenient, because if danger were always loud, the world would be easier to navigate. The truth is colder. Truly dangerous men rarely look the part. They move quietly through systems where performers are busy competing for attention. While the loud alpha argues, while the intellectual tyrant explains, while the silent pretender tries to appear mysterious, the dangerous man is studying leverage, because he understands a rule most people never discover. Attention attracts resistance. The moment a man publicly signals power, the environment begins pushing against him. Rivals appear, challenges emerge, people begin testing boundaries. Performance invites conflict, but invisible leverage avoids it. The dangerous man does not announce his intentions. He does not advertise his capabilities. He does not try to dominate every conversation or prove his intelligence. Instead, he lets others underestimate him. Underestimation is a strategic asset. When people misjudge you, they stop defending themselves properly. They reveal information. They expose weaknesses. They behave carelessly. This is when control becomes easier.
Because power rarely comes from intimidation. It comes from position. Position inside networks, position inside decision structures, position near the mechanisms that move resources. Dangerous men seek these positions relentlessly, and once they occupy them, they no longer need to argue. Outcomes begin shifting quietly. Opportunities appear, obstacles disappear, decisions start aligning with their interests. Observers often attribute these shifts to luck, but luck is usually invisible leverage, years of positioning that suddenly produce visible results. The performers are often confused when this happens because they assumed power belonged to the loudest voice. But voice is not authority. Authority is control over consequences, and consequences are controlled by the individuals who influence systems, not the individuals who dominate rooms. This is the quiet rule. Control the structure, ignore the theater. This principle has repeated itself across history. Kings surrounded themselves with powerful performers, generals, advisors, orators. But the most influential figures in those courts were often the least visible. Strategists, financiers, individuals who controlled access, information, or resources. They did not need applause, they needed proximity to decisions. The same pattern exists everywhere today, in corporations, in politics, in social hierarchies. There are performers, visible, loud, constantly projecting dominance. And then there are operators, quiet individuals who understand systems well enough to bend them slowly. The performer fights battles in public. The operator shapes the battlefield before the fight begins, which is why performers are often confused when they lose. They believed dominance was about intimidation, but intimidation rarely controls outcomes. Structure does. Once you understand this rule, the entire concept of power changes. You stop asking how to appear intimidating. You stop worrying about how people interpret your presence. You stop trying to project dominance constantly. Instead, you focus on a far colder question. Where is the leverage? Who controls access? Who controls information? Who influences decisions behind closed doors? Once you see those structures, you stop wasting time performing authority. You begin positioning yourself near the machinery. And this is where the final warning appears. Because once a man begins thinking like this, he cannot return to ignorance. He starts noticing performances everywhere. Conversations built on status signaling, arguments built on ego, men competing for dominance in rooms that control nothing. It becomes almost uncomfortable to watch because the illusion is obvious, the theater is transparent. And once you see the machinery behind power, the performance loses its value entirely. You no longer feel the need to compete for attention. You no longer feel the need to dominate conversations. You no longer care about appearing powerful, because you understand something far more useful. The world is not controlled by the loudest men. It is controlled by the men who quietly position themselves where decisions are made, where leverage accumulates, and where outcomes are determined long before anyone else realizes what happened. That is the rule dangerous men follow, and they rarely explain it. They simply operate.